There are some envelopes that arrive carrying more than paper. They arrive carrying a verdict. Mine arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning at exactly 9:14 a.m., slipping through the brass mail slot of my townhouse while I sat at the kitchen table reviewing a client's estate portfolio. I remember the precise time because I checked the security footage later, not because I doubted my memory, but because accuracy had been the foundation of my entire adult life. The envelope bore the return address of Prescott and Mercer attorneys at law, and within 60 seconds of opening it, I discovered something that explained every silence my family had ever mistaken for weakness. My grandfather, Victor Raymond Sterling, had died 6 weeks earlier. I had not been informed. I had not attended the funeral because no one had told me there was one. And despite all of that, I had been named the primary beneficiary of an estate worth more than $21 million. My name is not important. What matters is what I do. I have practiced estate law for 13 years. I draft wills, establish trusts, and spend my professional life studying the distance between what families say they value and what they actually fight over when money enters the room. I know how inheritance disputes begin. I know how they end. More importantly, I know how people behave when they believe they will never be held accountable. Looking back now, I realize that my profession was never incidental to this story. It was the reason my grandfather trusted me to understand what he was trying to protect. Victor Sterling built his wealth over 42 years in commercial real estate throughout the northeastern United States. He belonged to a generation that believed contracts mattered because words mattered. He was not an affectionate man in the traditional sense. He did not hug often or speak dramatically. Instead, he remembered birthdays, arrived when he promised, and listened carefully when others spoke. Those gestures, I eventually learned, carried more weight than grand declarations ever could. I was the only grandchild who called him consistently, not because I expected anything in return, but because I genuinely enjoyed hearing him think out loud. My mother, however, had developed a different relationship with Victor during his final years. As his health declined, she became increasingly involved in managing his affairs. She coordinated appointments, organized paperwork, and eventually arranged his move into a senior living facility in 2019. Publicly, she appeared devoted. She posted photographs online with captions about family loyalty and sacrifice. My father supported her efforts, driving trucks, carrying boxes, and participating in the performance of care. Meanwhile, I visited quietly. When Victor called 1 week after moving into the facility and told me his room smelled like someone else's memories, I drove nearly 3 hours to bring him his favorite lamp and our old chess set. We played 2 games that evening. He won both. Before I left, he held the Black Queen in his hand for several seconds longer than necessary. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Looking back, I suspect he already understood something I did not. Victor died on a Sunday morning in March. I discovered this fact 4 days later through a neighbor who had seen the obituary and assumed, incorrectly, that I already knew. I still remember opening the obituary online and noticing that my parents were listed among the surviving family members. I was not. The funeral had already happened. There had been flowers, speeches, photographs, and a guest book. My name appeared nowhere because I had never been invited to say goodbye. I printed the obituary, placed it into a folder, and labeled it with Victor's full name and the date. Then I sat alone at my desk for a very long time, staring at nothing. 6 weeks later, when the letter from Prescott and Mercer arrived and informed me that I was the primary beneficiary of Victor Sterling's estate, I did not cry. I did not call my parents. I simply picked up the phone, called the number listed at the bottom of the page, and scheduled a meeting for Thursday morning. What I did not know then was that my grandfather had spent years preparing for exactly what was about to happen. Thursday morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of silence that usually precedes a difficult conversation. I wore the same gray suit I reserved for major closings and estate hearings, partly out of habit and partly because I needed the comfort of professional ritual. When I entered the offices of Prescott and Mercer, I was greeted by a receptionist who spoke to me with the particular softness reserved for people presumed to be grieving. She escorted me to a conference room where Edward Prescott was already waiting. He was a man in his early 70s with a kind of stillness that comes from decades of delivering life-changing news. On the table beside him sat a banker's box, a stack of legal documents marked with colored tabs, and a photograph frame turned face down. Edward began by expressing his condolences. I thanked him. Then he opened the file and informed me that my grandfather had transferred all legal representation to his firm in 2018 and had revised his estate plan several times thereafter. The most significant amendment, he explained, occurred on April 4, 2021. I wrote the date in my notebook despite already knowing I would never forget it. 11 days earlier, my mother had officially registered herself as Victor's primary emergency contact at the senior facility. 11 days after that decision, Victor had visited Edward's office personally and rewritten nearly every major provision of his estate. The details unfolded with the precision of a carefully constructed argument. The primary trust beneficiary was me. 100% of the liquid assets and investment accounts, totaling approximately $17 million. The commercial real estate holdings, valued at more than $4 million, would transfer through a separate legal instrument, also naming me as the principal recipient. One exception existed: a parcel of land in North Carolina, which Victor had owned for decades, had been left to Margaret Ellis, his housekeeper of 17 years. Edward paused before reading Victor's explanation. She showed up when it mattered and asked for nothing. Hearing those words affected me more deeply than the financial figures ever could. My parents had not been excluded entirely. Victor had left each of them $25,000. Along with the money, he had left personal letters. Edward slid the banker's box toward me. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed in Victor's handwriting, the Black Queen from our chess set, and a photograph taken on the day of my law school graduation. On the back of the photograph, written in careful blue ink, were 6 words that caused me to look away for a moment. She always reads the fine print. I asked Edward to explain everything from the beginning. He nodded, as though he had been expecting that request. He told me that in February of 2021, my parents had contacted Victor's care facility, requesting an evaluation of his mental competency. According to their statements, they were concerned about cognitive decline. The assessment, conducted independently, had concluded that Victor remained fully competent and capable of making all personal and financial decisions. Shortly afterward, my parents had attempted to arrange meetings regarding modifications to his estate plan. Victor had apparently observed these efforts quietly before deciding to seek entirely new legal counsel. Then Edward showed me the file. It was nearly 4 inches thick. Inside were records of every inquiry, every request for financial access, every administrative contact initiated by my parents. Victor had personally instructed Edward to document everything. Every phone call, every visit, every unusual request. As I turned the pages, I felt something shift inside me. Grief was still there, but beneath it existed something colder: understanding. The most significant document appeared on page 31. It was a notarized letter, written entirely in Victor's own hand. Calm, precise, methodical, he described what he believed was happening around him and why he had chosen to restructure his estate accordingly. He wrote exactly as he played chess, never wasting a move. I read the final paragraph 3 times before looking up. When I finally left Edward's office that afternoon, I carried 2 boxes of documents and one unbearable realization. My grandfather had not merely anticipated a legal challenge, he had anticipated my family. And 2 weeks later, my mother called and asked me to come to dinner. My mother's call came on a Saturday morning. Her voice carried that particular tone parents sometimes adopt when they believe they are managing a situation rather than participating in it. She asked whether I could join the family for dinner that evening because there were a few complicated matters concerning Victor's estate that needed to be discussed together. She sounded almost gentle, almost concerned. I agreed immediately, not because I wanted answers, but because by then I already had them. Their dining room looked exactly as I remembered it, the same polished wooden table, the same framed photographs arranged strategically along the walls. My father sat at the head of the table with the posture of someone preparing to chair a board meeting. My younger brother, Ethan, had flown in from Atlanta. He looked uncomfortable before anyone had spoken a word. My mother served dinner carefully, maintaining the performance of normalcy with remarkable discipline. For the first 20 minutes, nobody mentioned Victor directly. Instead, they discussed travel plans, property values, and the weather, as though the absence sitting at the table with us could somehow be ignored into submission. Eventually, my father cleared his throat and shifted the conversation toward what he called the estate situation. He spoke with confidence about preserving family assets and ensuring that Victor's wishes were honored properly. My mother nodded frequently. She described the sacrifices she and my father had made during Victor's final years and emphasized how important family unity would be moving forward. Ethan remained silent. He pushed food around his plate and avoided eye contact. Listening to them was an extraordinary experience because I realized, with growing certainty, that none of them had actually seen Victor's will. They were constructing an entire future based on assumptions they had never bothered to verify. I ate quietly and asked very few questions. Years of legal practice had taught me that silence often reveals more than confrontation. After dinner, my mother offered to walk me outside. The night air was cool, and for several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, she turned toward me with an expression that appeared carefully rehearsed. She explained that Victor had required extensive support during his final years, and that she and my father had carried most of that burden. Then she smiled gently and said she hoped I would not make things unnecessarily difficult. I looked at her for several seconds before speaking. Who requested the competency evaluation in February of 2021? I asked. The change in her expression lasted less than a second, but it was enough. I don't know what you're talking about, she replied. I nodded once. Good night. I sat in my car for exactly 3 minutes before calling Edward Prescott's office. When the voicemail system answered, I left a brief message. Please begin the notification process, I said. Send the letters. 3 weeks later, my parents organized what they called a family meeting. They invited Ethan, my aunt Catherine Brooks, and her husband, Richard Hayes. My mother arranged chairs in a circle in their living room, a detail I found strangely revealing. She opened the discussion by emphasizing the importance of presenting a unified family position. My father discussed legal expenses. Richard repeated the word contest several times with the enthusiasm of someone using a newly learned vocabulary term. Ethan remained silent. Then, my mother finally stated what everyone had gathered to say. She believed Victor's estate had been altered under undue influence. She intended to prove that I had manipulated an elderly man suffering from cognitive decline. The room became very still. I asked whether I might respond. My mother gestured toward me. I opened my folder. First, I placed Edward's engagement agreement on the coffee table, establishing the date Victor had retained independent legal counsel. Then, I produced the estate amendment dated April 4th, 2021. Next came the competency evaluation they themselves had commissioned, confirming Victor's complete mental capacity. Finally, without saying a word, I placed the 4-inch documentation file onto the table. Nobody spoke. My mother stared at the file as though she recognized it. Because she did. Then, I removed one final document, Victor's notarized letter, and I began to read. I held Victor's notarized letter carefully, aware that everyone present understood, perhaps for the first time, that this conversation was no longer happening on their terms. My father remained standing near the fireplace. My mother sat rigidly in her chair. Ethan stared at the table. Richard looked confused. Catherine appeared frightened. I began reading. Victor's handwriting was exactly as I remembered it, deliberate, disciplined, impossible to misinterpret. He described, in precise chronological order, the changes he had observed in family behavior after discussions of his estate had become more frequent. He documented conversations, requests, and moments that had apparently concerned him deeply. There was no anger in his words. That was what made them devastating. He was not writing to punish anyone. He was recording observations, the way an accountant records numbers or a lawyer records facts. Then, I reached the sentence that changed the atmosphere in the room completely. I have watched my daughter and her husband manage my care with increasing attention to my assets and decreasing attention to my wishes. I am old, but I am neither blind nor confused. No one moved. I continued reading. Victor explained why he had retained independent counsel. He explained why he had requested documentation of every interaction involving his finances. He explained why he had revised his estate plan after concluding that some members of his family viewed his declining health as an administrative opportunity rather than a personal responsibility. Finally, he explained why he had chosen me. She showed up when there was nothing to gain. That is the only qualification that has ever mattered to me. The silence that followed felt almost physical. My mother spoke first. "That's not what happened," she said quietly. For the first time that evening, her voice lacked certainty. My father attempted to recover control of the room. He argued that older people could be influenced. He insisted that family disagreements were normal and that no document could fully capture intent. His words sounded increasingly desperate even to him. Richard offered an opinion about jury trials before realizing nobody was listening. Then Ethan spoke. "I didn't know about the funeral." He said it while looking at the floor. "I knew they were talking about the estate. I knew they thought things should go a certain way, but I didn't know they never told you he died." His honesty landed harder than any argument could have. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the black chess queen Victor had left me. Carefully, I placed it on top of the documents resting on the coffee table. "He always played black," I said. Nobody answered. "Because black moves second," I continued, and Victor believed that moving second meant paying closer attention. I stood up and put on my coat. My mother called my name as I walked toward the door. There was fear in her voice now. Real fear. Not because she had suddenly understood what Victor thought of her, but because she had finally understood that he had anticipated everything. "I'll see you in probate court," I said. The contest was filed 12 days later. It never reached a hearing. The probate court reviewed the competency assessment my parents had requested. Victor's notarized statement, the documented timeline assembled by Edward Prescott, and the estate instruments executed under independent legal supervision. The ruling itself was brief. 12 words. Testator's intent and capacity are not subject to reasonable dispute. That was the end of the legal battle. The estate transferred exactly as Victor intended. Margaret Ellis received the North Carolina property and called me afterward. She cried before she could speak. Ethan called 8 weeks later and apologized without excuses or qualifications. I told him I heard him. At that time, it was the only honest answer I could give. My parents filed one additional challenge through different counsel 6 months later. It was dismissed in less than 7 weeks. Today, the black chess queen sits on my desk beside my computer monitor. Sometimes, when clients explain why a document should not mean what it plainly says, I look at it and remember Victor. People often believe that inheritance is about money. They're wrong. Money was never what my family tried to take. What they tried to take was a man's final and deliberate statement about who had truly shown up when it mattered. Victor understood something my family never did. Calm is not surrender. Silence is not weakness. And the people who keep the best records rarely need to raise their voices. If this story reminded you that quiet loyalty is often remembered long after loud performances are forgotten, hold on to that. Sometimes, the people who say the least leave behind the clearest truth.